Hello, Brubs. We're back with Buried Alive, the terrifying history of our most primal fear by Jan Bondeson. Bondeson. Let's get some more European names in there so I can botch them. Thanks, Claude. Chapter 4, the 18th Century Debate. Parted from God, the soul is dead. Buried alive, the graceless soul. His conscience, as with worms, o'erspread, no sepulchre is half so foul. C and J. Wesley, Short Hymns on Select Passages of the Holy Scriptures, Bristol, 1762, hymn number 1975. Not until 1752 was there any serious opposition to Bruyère's dissertation sur l'incertitude des signes de labor. Antoine Louis was an opinionated young surgeon at the Salle Perterier Hospital in Paris and a protege of the celebrated Francois de la Peyronie. Well, if that's what Peyronie's disease is named after, the premier surgeon to the king. He held Bruyère responsible for the premature burial hysteria that reigned in France by having reproduced as medical facts in his ill-researched book a lot of ridiculous stories invented to amuse women and children. I've never seen so many pages get burnished by anything like this book. The main motive at Louis' attack, it has been presumed, was defending the honor of the medical profession. At this time, the French countryside was full of quacks and itinerant charlatans who posed a serious threat to the professional medical men. The French peasants were not unreasonably of the opinion that if the doctor could not tell a living man from a dead one, he was good for nothing. Bruyère's ideas about the uncertainty of the signs of death thus threatened the authority of the medical profession at large. But there is evidence that Louis was prompted by more ignoble motives. It is very likely that he had observed, with a mixture of jealousy and dismay, the meteoric rise of Jean-Jacques Bruyère within the Parisian medical community. In 1742, Bruyère had been an unknown middle-aged practitioner. Now he was an author of international acclaim, acknowledged as one of the leading medical theorists of the time. One 18th century writer says that Louis was dismayed not only by the spreading fear of premature burial induced by Bruyère's books, but also by their rapid sale. Another, that he felt personal hatred toward Bruyère and envied his fame as philanthropist. The German translator of Bruyère, Professor Jank, writing 2 years after Louis' book had been published, dismissed the book lightly and claimed that it was all well known that there was a personal animosity between Louis and Bruyère. Antoine Louis was just 29 years old when his Lettres sur la certitude des signes de la mort was published. He had structured it as a series of letters directed to a fictitious correspondent, one of the many honest Frenchmen frightened by Bruyère's dissertation. He declared himself both amazed and dismayed that Bruyère's book had been approved and honored by so many academies all over the country. Louis was a young surgeon, not a historical scholar, and could not add to the arguments of the Abbé Desfontaines, I don't know how to say it, about the veracity of some of the older cases. The wily Bruyère had used his second volume to prove the dubious tales in the first, with the claim that an unproven fact was better than a false one. But it was still wrong, Louis replied, to make vulgar people believe extraordinary things without sufficient proof. Far from finding the tale of the lecherous monk in any way not suspect, he quoted it at length and then tried to reinterpret the conclusion. The monk had not really believed that the girl was dead, since her face, as the story went, had not been disfigured by the horrors of death. Another ludicrous argument of his was that the error of Vesalius, the veracity of which he doubted as little as Bruyere and Winslow had, should not be used to discredit the medical profession, since it was well known that Vesalius had such a passion for the study of anatomy that it sometimes got the better of him. Nor does the following case report, which he discussed at length, aid Louise's. How the hell you say Louise's? Louis. How the fuck would you say Louis, or is it Louis? Louis is. I mean, if it's Louis, it'd be Louise. Louise's cause. In February 1746, a young country girl died at the Hotel Dieu hospital. One of the nuns told Louis's pupils that they could take her corpse to the dissection room for use in the anatomy lessons the next day. But late at night, plaintive sounds and pitiful sighs could be heard coming from the deserted anatomical theater. One of the frightened students ran to fetch Louis, who was horrified to see the girl's body contorted in an unnatural manner inside her shroud. One leg had actually been pushed through the shroud and reached the floor. She was now really dead, and Louis admitted to feeling both horror and dismay when he surveyed this lugubrious scene. Using his usual kind of logic, he argued that it had been an ignorant young medical student who had mishandled the corpse into the dissection room, not a proper doctor, and that this occurrence, although tragic, was no proof for the uncertainty of the signs of death. What's up, bruv? The polemical attitude of Louis did his cause no good, nor did his attempts to use the reductio ad absurdum approach of the traditional medical theses. Not content with blasting Bruyere for his credulity and medical charlatanism, he launched an attack on the old Winslow. With rather questionable logic, he claimed that if the elderly anatomist really believed that the signs of death were uncertain, he was a mass murderer, since many of his subjects in the dissection room would probably still have been alive, and yet he had cut them up. Louis was much offended by Bruyere's accusation that even a trained medical practitioner was unable to tell a living person from a dead one. In reviewing Bruyere's cases, he found that in many of them no doctor had been called to see the apparently dead person. Vulgar people, not well-trained doctors, had made the fatal mistakes, and in the case of the nobleman Jean de Lavore, had it not been his clever physician who saved his life by blowing strong pepper down his nostrils. Antoine Louis believed that rigor mortis and certain changes in the cornea of the eyes were even surer signs of death than was putrefaction, which might occur in a festering gangrenous limb. He also objected to the use of putrefaction as the sole sign of death, since the delayed burial of corpses meant that putrefying bodies were left lying around in the dwelling houses for a considerable time. He felt that this was protecting the interest of the dead to an immoderate degree, while exposing the surviving relatives to the emotional distress of having decaying bodies about. Furthermore, the corpses spread deadly miasmata of contagion, which might poison the living people in the household. To try to revive apparently dead people, Louis used a remarkable apparatus made specially for the purpose to administer enemas of to awaken those apparently dead. One of the contraption, which rather resembled an oversized set of bagpipes, was thrust up the presumed corpse's rear passage, and another was connected by way of a powerful bellows to a large furnace full of tobacco. What? Louis prided himself that several Dutch and German physicians, anxious to know the latest advances in clinical medicine, had been to France to see these enemas of tobacco smoke being administered to the hapless corpses at the Paris morgue. It is apparent that Louis thought Bruyere a horror-monger, an avaricious medical busybody and dilettante, and a traitor who willfully accused the medical profession of ignorance to further his own reputation as a writer. But Bruyere, still alive and well in 1752, thought Louis an envious young whippersnapper of a surgeon who insolently tried to usurp some of his own fame. In a furious rebuff, the elderly physician took young M. Louis to task in the Mercure de France magazine, saying, and I repeat, saying, his book was both badly researched and uncouth, and his accusations against more senior medical practitioners like himself and Winslow ungentlemanly. The way Louis had advertised his book by pasting up posters all over Paris and even in Versailles was disgraceful to the medical profession at large. Bruyere ended by declaring himself absolutely unconvinced by the arguments in Louis's book. The signs of death discussed in it were all more or less fallible. Louis rather meekly replied that it was the bookseller who had put up all the advertising posters, not himself. He also thought that Bruyere had himself behaved in an ungentlemanly manner. Politeness was an essential part of any literary or scholarly debate, and he could detect no trace of it in Bruyere's vituperative missive. In the 19th and 20th century, some positivist medical historians applauded Antoine Louis for what they called his refutation of Bruyere's errors and his stalwart defense of the medical profession. His thesis that signs of death were reliable and that people had not been at risk of being buried alive agreed well with what people thought, or at least wanted to think, really was the truth. But both the quality of Louis's book and its influence at the time have been considerably overrated. Bruyere's dissertation was elegantly written and closely and convincingly argued and presented its medical points in a way accessible to the educated layperson. Louis was a less accomplished writer and also emerges as a narrow minded zealot whose refusal to acknowledge any form of wrongdoing on the part of the medical profession must have evoked skepticism even at the time. Many of his arguments were far from impressive, and he could not deny two mainstays of Bruyere's case. People had been buried alive in all ages, and there were some alarming recent instances of fatal mistakes in declaring people dead. The French reviews of Louis's book were mixed, and in later 18th century writings, an apparent death references to it are generally dismissive. Nor did it appear in any foreign translation. Why, if Louis was so successful in calming the minds of the mid 18th century people, was a great number of books, pamphlets, and theses on apparent death and premature burial published from 1760 until the end of the century, and well into the next one. There is no doubt that Bruyere was the winner of the mid 18th century French debate on the uncertainty of the signs of death. The majority of the medical men took his side in the controversy and disregarded the objections of Louis. Bruyere's theories were doubtless also predominant among lay people. The mid 18th century upsurge in fear of premature burial can easily be verified in literature, debate, and public sentiment. An interesting study of Parisian wills demonstrates that whereas only 2 out of 1,000 wills from 1710 to 1725 detailed safeguards against premature burial, no fewer than 13 out of 1,000 wills from 1760 to 1777 did so, and a further 34 wills asked for a delay in burial for unspecified reasons. The underlying reasons for the immediate appeal of Bruyere's book and the fear of premature burial that ensued all over Europe have been discussed by several historians. The prevailing hypothesis, supported by Philippe Aris and the majority of later writers, is that the fear of being buried alive was a byproduct of the ongoing process of de-Christianization. Many people had begun to question the traditional Christian dogma, and the secular rationalism left an emotional vacuum for those who had to confront the thought of death without the hope of paradise. This led to an increased fear of death. Once death had been deprived of the time honored assurance of the Christian faith, people became concerned about what happened to their dead, or perhaps not so dead bodies if they did not enter a better world in the odor of sanctity. What befell them? The physical torments of a premature burial, the ghoulish minutiae of gnawed hands, bruised heads, and beaten bodies that recur in Bruyère's books may be taken to represent some kind of secularized hell, but several other factors, sociological, medical, and personal, acted in favor of Bruyere. Wooden coffins were introduced, Aries, Arius tells us, after the 13th century, but at this time, coffins themselves were prerogatives of the wealthy. Their use for ordinary people became increasingly common with time, but in the 16th century, many people were still buried in their shrouds without coffins. In 1569, a communal coffin was used in one part of London to transport the corpses of the poor to the grave, and an account from Rye in Kent tells us that by 1580, coffins in this town were reserved for its leading citizens. In Scotland, at the same time, a death hamper was reused as a means of transportation for poor people. It was turned over in the grave to deliver its shrouded cargo into the earth. A similar contraption was employed in Brittany. In the 1603 plague epidemic in London, coffins were rare and expensive. The dead were just covered with a winding sheet, or is that a winding sheet, before burial. There is evidence that in some parts of England, the use of coffins did not fully take hold until after the Restoration. The use of wooden coffins increased considerably in the 17th and early 18th centuries for all classes of people except the destitute, poor. Since the deceased individual now had private space in death, a close, impenetrable wooden shell buried under several feet of earth, it is not unnatural that anxious and worried people were susceptible to arguments of what would happen if the buried person was not really dead. It is apparent from the 18th century wills detailing safeguards against apparent death that the people were not frightened of merely being mistaken for dead. It was the specific fear that they might awaken in a coffin that prompted their actions. Some individuals specified autopsy, embalming, or even decapitation to make sure they would really be dead when buried. In the early 18th century, observations from different fields of medicine and natural history introduced a novel uncertainty concerning the organism's capacity for life without respiration or heartbeat, and without taking any form of nourishment. A curious and still unexplained zoological mystery, that of the toad in the hole, provided some unexpected arguments. Since the Middle Ages, there had been numerous reports of toads found completely enclosed in blocks of stone. Quarrymen and masons were no strangers to these mysterious toads, which were usually still living when freed from their narrow cells in the stone. The original observers of these toads in the hole had viewed them as the products of witchcraft and sorcery. In the late 17th century, however, men of science became more aware of this obscure mystery. Had the toads been encased in stone ever since the stones were formed after the deluge? And how could they live for perhaps thousands of years without access to food, air, or water? The French medical scientist Claude Nicolas Lecat was not the only person to draw parallels between the slumbering half lives of the entombed toads and the similar trance like states in human beings. Another of the old zoological myths that the swallows hibernated on the bottom of lakes added a further argument. These birds were presumed to exist without access to food and air throughout their hibernation. In the second volume of his dissertation, Jean Jacques Bruyère gave a lengthy account of the strange habits of these birds, quoting observations from many old authorities. Another strange phenomenon was the fasting girls, who claimed to be able to live for months or even years without taking any form of nourishment. It In the 16th century, such cases had been presumed to be supernatural in origin. The decade-long fast of Marguerite Weiss of Speyer was the subject of a broadside in 1542. Noted for her piety, she claimed to take nourishment only from the transubstantiation of holy wafers that floated down her throat. Barbara of Ula, a Westphalian girl, said she had fasted for a year after being bewitched. Both of these girls were exposed as frauds after being put under strict supervision. But the reputation of the Dutch girl Eva Vliegen, who claimed to have lived 17 years sustained only by the scent of flowers, remains untarnished. Right. In the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the fasting girls were no longer considered miraculous. Instead, just like the screaming cadavers, the toad in the hole, and the hibernating swallows, they became interesting and instructive phenomena of natural history and physiology. Several of them were described before various learned societies, foremost among them the young Englishwoman Martha Taylor, whose supposed year long fast was the subject of a discourse given before the Royal Society of London in 1669. Even more important for the growing anxiety about the uncertainty of the signs of death were the writings of Pechlin and Langlois, mentioned in the preceding chapter concerning individuals who had stayed alive underwater for prolonged periods of time. The astounding observation of the submarine gardener Eric Bjornson can be verified from other independent sources, and it lent an undeserved aura of credibility to some of Pecklin's other cases, like the tales of the Laplander who had once drowned for 6 weeks before being rescued, and the merry young Gasolinus, who had taken a 15-day dive before emerging alive and well. And I lost my spot. Tales that being wholly to the realm of fantasy, the Bjornson case even came to the attention of the Royal Society of London. The secretary of this famous body, Henry Oldenburg, wrote to the Swedish scholars Jorg Steinerhelm, and Urban Jarn to obtain details of it, which the two Swedes willingly provided. One of Jarn's correspondents was Robert Hooke, and the case of the submarine gardener may well have inspired this noted physiologist to perform his famous experiment of preserving animals alive by blowing air through their lungs with bellows. As he himself expressed it, Hooke was the first person to demonstrate that the supply of air to the lungs and not the respiratory movements in themselves was necessary for life. In a way, the 1740s were exactly the right time for fears of being buried alive to develop. There was still a good deal of superstition about abnormal fasts, hibernating swallows, and submarine humans, but the rationalist 18th century medical scientists no longer considered these matters to be supernatural. Just as Bruyère had changed the interpretation of Kornmann's miracles of the dead into factual observations of people in extremis being buried alive, they used these observations to extend the limits of human physiology and to cast doubt on the prevailing signs of death, particularly the lack of respiration and arterial pulsations. Even more important, in 1740, the year Winslow's thesis was published, René Antoine Foucault de Remer published the earliest observation of artificial respiration in a short work on how to resuscitate drowned people. That an unconscious, breathless, pulseless individual could be brought back to life by such means was nothing less than sensational, and it did more than anything else to increase the uncertainty about the currently used signs of death. The enterprising Bruyère was well aware of this and even included the entire text of Remir's paper to the 1742 volume of his dissertation. The preface of the English translation of Bruyère's book stressed artificial respiration as a major reason for doubting the reliability of the traditional signs of death. A no less important factor was also overlooked by earlier commentators: the personality of Jean Jacques Bruyère. If Winslow was the typical scholar, quiet, unassuming, and unworldly, Bruyère was an entrepreneurial, flamboyant homme de monde. From 1742 until his death in 1756, he personified the anti premature burial agitation in France, and the collected edition of his books on the subject filled a small bookcase. Much of the increasing anxiety about the uncertainty of the signs of death and the rapid upsurge in fear of premature burial in mid 18th century France was due to his clever and ceaseless agitation. It would be unfair to accuse him of being guided by selfish motives. Not even Louis did that, but the considerable fame he derived from his championship of burial reform cannot have been unwelcome for an ambitious, middle aged man who had spent most of his previous life in relative obscurity. Jean Jacques Bruyère was the winner of the debate on the uncertainty of the signs of death, and after the objections of Louis had been brushed aside, the majority of doctors and educated people agreed with his views on the subject. For example, the article on death in the famous Encyclopedia of Diderot and D'Alembert closely adhered to the teachings of Bruyère. The influential naturalist Georges Louis Leclerc de Buffon was also influenced by Bruyère, and traces of his arguments can be found in the writings of the great physiologist Albrecht von Haller. Bruyère's book reached a wide audience, and some of his readers wanted to carry on his campaign for burial reform. These volumes were to serve the anti premature burial activists as a repository of gruesome anecdotes for years to come. The first horror mongering pamphlet, entitled Terrible Torture and Cruel Despair of People Presumed Dead Who Are Buried Alive, appeared in 1752 within Bruyère's lifetime. By this time, the regulation of burial customs in rural France was left to the clerical authorities in the individual dioceses, and there is evidence that they were much aware of Bruyère's new theories, possibly as a result of his ceaseless efforts to promote his work at various academies. Quite a few French dioceses either made it obligatory to wait 12 or 24 hours between death and burial, or started to enforce legalization that was already in place. As early as 1617, the Diocese of Angers had stipulated that a period of 12 hours elapsed before any person was buried, but it appears that Bruyère's arguments changed the way this ancient law was interpreted. By 1755, the king's prosecutor in Angers took to court a woman called La Jumelle, whose work it had been to transport corpses to the cemetery for burying people too soon. At the trial, one witness treated the jurors to a reading from a popular pamphlet on premature burial about a man who had eaten his hands in despair when awakening in the tomb. Another witness had himself seen a man stir in the local mortuary after having falsely been presumed dead. Considerable anger was directed at the wretched La Jumelier, whose ignorance and undue haste had exposed people to the danger of a horrible death underground. Particularly in France, at this time there also was a fear of the putrefactive fumes emanating from old churchyards. These mephitic exhalations were considered very detrimental to people's health, and from the 1740s onward they gained increasing prominence as a causative agent of disease. The observations gathered to promote this view ranged from the factual cemetery workers who fainted when entering old vaults far below ground and contagion from corpses that had died in epidemics, to the ridiculous that a putrid corpse poisoned an entire family of 13, or that all children who grew up near a cemetery became stunted and feeble-minded. Medical as well as populist writing on this subject existed, along with appeals to move all cemeteries out from the cities and get rid of this serious threat to the public health. The appeals were answered by counter arguments. One was that several anatomists who had spent all their working lives among putrid corpses had become nonagenarians, one of them being our old friend Jacques Benin Winslow. Benin. The fear of putrid exhalations also affected the appeals for burial reform. It was considered unrealistic to keep dead bodies above ground for several days, awaiting putrefaction, since the gain in saving a few apparently dead people would be offset by epidemics of mephitic poisoning from the charnel houses where the corpses were to be kept. An anonymous 18th century French drawing of a corpse awakening on the dissection table, frightening the anatomist. Copyright The Wellcome Trust. The French fear of being mistaken for dead was further fueled by a widespread tale about the death of the Abbé Prévost, the famous author of Manon Lescaut. In November 1763, the Abbé was found dead in the Chantilly Park. The cause of death was suspected to be apoplexy. He was taken to the house of the local surgeon, who proceeded to dissect the presumed corpse, but at the first incision, Prévost gave a loud cry and grasped the surgeon's hand. One version then says that he bled to death after the first stroke of the scalpel. Another that he wrestled with the surgeon, broke free, and ran screaming from the house, but fell dead outside its gates. Both of these stories were disseminated by a writer named Antoine de Laplace, who claimed to have received the details from the Abbé de Blanchelande, Prévost's brother, but this gentleman denied the tale emphatically. The official procès verbal of the Abbé Prévost's death mentions nothing of any dramatic premature dissection. Posterity again preferred a good story to the truth. However, and the horrid death of Prévost was repeated by many anti-premature burial campaigners. The event even gave rise to the often repeated bon mot, albeit one unlikely to appeal to a medical negligence lawyer. The philosophical M. de Laplace, who claimed to have been a great friend of the late Abbé Prévost, was asked by some of his other friends what they should do about the careless surgeon who had caused the Abbé's unnecessary death. "Just sigh and remain silent," said M. de Laplace, in the spirit of the true Christian forgiveness. Several other countries took up the worries about premature burial. The Austrian court physician Gerard von Swieten agreed with Bruyère that putrefaction was the only certain sign of death. In 1756, 2 years after the German translation of Bruyère's book had been published, he proposed to the Empress Maria Theresia that it become obligatory throughout Austria that at least 48 hours passed between death and burial. The corpses could be kept in communal morgues if the bereaved relatives did not want to have them in their houses. Many German states followed suit and demanded the delay in burial of between 24 and 48 hours. Frankfurt and Saxony even extended this to 3 full days. This led to trouble with the Jewish population, whose time-honored practice had been to bury the dead as soon as possible. In 1772, a certain Dr. J.P. Brinkman published a book arguing that premature burials occurred frequently in Germany. He quoted extensively from Yonk's translation of Bruyère and repeated many of the spurious old cases. The same year, the Duke of Mecklenburg, Schwerin, issued a regulation that required Jews to allow at least 3 days to elapse between death and burial. There was considerable opposition to this proposal from the local Jewish groups. The influential Jewish philosopher Moses Mendelssohn wrote a letter to the Duke suggesting that the regulation be changed to say that no Jew should be buried without death being certified by a physician, and the Duke accepted this compromise. Mendelssohn had also written that, in his opinion, the ducal proposal violated no religious law, but the Orthodox Mecklenburg Jews disagreed. In 1787, the physician Marcus Herz, a close associate of Mendelssohn's, wrote a pamphlet arguing against early burials. He did not resort to religious arguments to convert his fellow Jews, preferring to frighten them with graphic descriptions of a man awakening in his coffin. By this time, the horror mongering pamphlets of Brinkman and other authors were on the market, and Herz had no lack of material with which to curdle his readers' blood. His pamphlet had the desired effect. Growing minorities within the Jewish community formed burial societies that abandoned certain elements in their traditional ritual and that kept their dead above ground for 2 or 3 days. It has also been demonstrated that in Belgium, the time between death and burial was gradually extended to between 1 and 2 days during the 1770s and 1780s. Thus, one largely positive effect of Bruyère's work was that it became accepted practice throughout large parts of Europe to wait at least 12 or 24 hours before any person was buried. This was a compromise between the fear of premature burial and the similarly potent fear of mephitic poisoning from the corpses, thus producing a period of observation for individuals presumed dead but not awaiting the full development of putrefaction. The demonstration of the uncertainty of the signs of death, particularly in the hands of careless, uneducated people, was heeded by medical practitioners all over Europe. Bruyère's words of warning that special care be taken with people thought dead from apoplexy, drowning, freezing to death, and hysteric passions were largely sound. Along with his directions for vigorous resuscitations of such presumed corpses, this advice probably saved many people from death, and some from being buried alive. The second positive effect of Bruyère's work was that his redefinition of death as a sometimes treatable, not always irreversible medical condition set the stage for the appearance of humane societies dedicated to saving people from apparent death. By the 1760s, it was clear to many physicians that a lingering death from drowning, asphyxia, seizures, or accidents, victims of these latter calamities could be resuscitated and brought back to life, even if they had ceased to breathe. The first humane society was founded in 1767 in Amsterdam, where many people were lost in the canals every year. Venice, Milan, and Paris followed suit. And the Royal Humane Society was founded in London in 1774. Before long, Philadelphia, Massachusetts, and New York had humane societies as well. The societies were often found and led by physicians, but they encouraged the general public to learn resuscitation techniques and give medals and rewards to successful lifesavers. In 1775, a Prussian society paid 30 marks for successful and 15 for unsuccessful attempts to resuscitate people found in a lifeless condition. It paid no rewards when it suspected poisoning to be involved, probably to discourage abuse of the system by people who deliberately poisoned others to gain money through resuscitating them. Doctors were also entitled to these rewards, but it was expressly stated that prison doctors were not. Clearly, the philanthropic Prussians had no desire to perpetuate the criminal classes. Although the humane societies and the anti-premature burial propagandists were destined to go their separate ways in the 1800s, it is clear that a kind of cross-fertilization between these groups occurred in the late 18th century. The humane societies were obviously affected by the arguments for resuscitation of apparently dead people presented by Bruyère, Brinkman, and others. At the same time, the public acceptance of the notion that a person who had ceased to breathe could still be successfully revived caused them to further doubt the definition of death as explicitly discussed by some French pamphlet writers on premature burial. The founder of the Royal Humane Society of London, Dr. William Hawes, was also the author of a tract on premature internment, in which he used the Society's resuscitation case records to demonstrate the fallibility of the signs of death, except for putrefaction. But although the English establishment embraced the idea of humane societies, the vast majority of the medical profession turned a deaf ear to the 18th century agitation regarding premature burials, and there was no question of extending the period between death and funeral because of these concerns. But already at this time, there is evidence that some English people left legacies to their family physicians to safeguard themselves against this gruesome fate. In 1769, Lord Chesterfield wrote, "All I desire for my own burial is not to be buried alive." Miss Hannah Beswick, a wealthy spinster living in Manchester at about the same time, was even more frightened of being prematurely buried after her brother had narrowly escaped this dire fate. She left 20,000 guineas to her family physician, Dr. Charles White, on the condition that she never be buried, that her body instead be embalmed and kept in the doctor's collection of anatomical preparations. Every day for several years, the doctor and two reliable witnesses were to lift the veil and survey the countenance of this macabre resident patient for any signs of life. Later, the doctor put Miss Beswick's mummy inside an old clock case and opened the clock face once a year to see how his favorite patient was doing. Thanks to her eccentric will, the immortal Miss Beswick became quite a celebrity. As a child, Thomas de Quincey was taken to Dr. White's house in Lower King Street, Manchester, to see the mummy inside the old grandfather clock. The doctor loyally fulfilled his side of the deal to the end. After his death in 1813, Miss Beswick's mummy was taken to the Manchester Natural History Museum, where it was publicly shown in the entrance hall. Finally, it was decently interred in 1868. That's crazy. That's flopping crazy, buddy.